There are many great wars in history, battles and campaigns which were decisive in determining the fate of nations, conflicts which lasted for years, claiming millions of lives, but sometimes it's the smaller conflicts which offer the greatest insight into the nature of warfare. In 1896, the British Empire was at the height of its power. Its navy ruled the seas, its army was the largest and most capable in the world, and its influence stretched across the globe. It also controlled large parts of Africa, having fought many wars to subdue local rulers and install compliant leaders who would look after their interests. One such place was the island of Zanzibar, located off the coast of modern Tanzania. For centuries, Zanzibar had been a wealthy and powerful state, renowned for its role in the spice trade and its importance as an entrepot in the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately for the Zanzibaris, however, it also became notorious for another, much more sinister trade, being one of the biggest hubs for the slave trade in East Africa. Although slavery had been outlawed by the British in 1807, it continued unchecked in many parts of their empire, including Zanzibar. There was a lot of money to be made by those involved in this illicit trade, and the Sultan of Zanzibar, along with local Arab and Indian traders, became very wealthy as a result. But the trade was one thing that Britain could not tolerate and increasingly pressured the Sultan to crack down on the practice. After decades of half-hearted attempts, this culminated in the signing of the 1890 Slavery Abolition Treaty, supposedly outlawing the slave trade and promising the liberation of slaves within 5 years. However, reports from the British consul suggested that this treaty was largely ignored, and so in 1894 the British government dispatched a naval squadron to Zanzibar to force the Sultan to comply. Faced with superior firepower, the Sultan agreed to end the slave trade immediately and abolish slavery altogether by 1897. Over the next 2 years, the British supervised the emancipation of some 20,000 slaves, providing them with land and financial support to start a new life. But the pro-slavery Arabs and Indians lost considerable wealth during this process and harbored resentment against both the British and the former slaves, who they felt had been encouraged by the British to betray them. Then, on August 25, 1896, the pro-British Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. He was succeeded by his cousin Khalid bin Barghash, who was visiting the mainland at the time. But before he could take the throne, his rivals, backed by British advisors, insisted that he must swear to uphold the terms of the anti-slavery treaties and recognize the British protectorate over Zanzibar. Upon his return to Zanzibar, Khalid realized that these demands went against his own interests and those of his supporters, and so refused to comply. Instead, he took control of the main palace, imprisoned rival factions, and raised a small army of 3,000 men to defend it. These forces consisted of palace guards, askari irregulars and volunteers, armed with a variety of rifles and artillery taken from trading ships and coastal forts. Additionally, the Sultan placed 3 of his 4 warships, the 21-gun Sultana, the 12-gun gunboat No. 2, and the 10-gun rover, in defensive positions around the harbor to protect him from attack. Meanwhile, the British, upon hearing of Khalid's actions, demanded his surrender, but Khalid was confident in his defenses and rejected these demands, hoping that the British would soon get bored and lose interest in the conflict. However, the British had no intention of allowing a power grab by an irresponsible leader, and on August 27th sent a fleet of 6 warships to enforce their demands. In total, there were 7 vessels present: HMS St. George, HMS Raccoon, HMS Pyramus, and HMS Helicon, representing the Royal Navy, as well as the Sultana, the gunboat No. 2, and the rover, representing the Zanzibar Navy. The British fleet was by far the most powerful, mounting over 200 guns compared to Zanzibar's 56. Even one of the Royal Navy ships alone, HMS St. George, had more firepower than the entire Zanzibar Navy. At 3 p.m., a British envoy arrived at the Sultan's palace demanding Khalid's surrender once again, but once more the Sultan refused. At 5:55 p.m., the envoy departed, reporting that the situation was unchanged. Just 1 hour later, the British ultimatum expired and HMS St. George opened fire. At 9 a.m., the bombardment of the palace began. The British ships formed a semicircle around the harbor and unleashed their heavy guns on the palace and its defenses. Meanwhile, Khalid's forces returned fire, but despite their best efforts, they were hopelessly outgunned. And as the battle progressed, it became clear that they were losing. The Sultan's palace was surrounded by a high stone wall, but this was no match for the British guns. They bombarded the structure until its walls crumbled, setting the thatched roof on fire. Large shells could be seen crashing into the building every few seconds, blowing apart its wooden pillars and shaking the ground. As the palace burned, British sailors watched from the sea as the Zanzibar army and palace guards desperately tried to fight back. They fired on the British ships and attempted to man the island's coastal defenses, but their weapons were inferior to the British and their fortifications poorly designed. The bulk of the British ships were protected by thick metal plating, protecting them from anything the Zanzibaris could throw at them. Furthermore, the ships were designed for oceanic warfare and moved much faster than the slower, clumsier shore-based guns. To make matters worse, the British ships enjoyed superior fire control and their gunners had experience in naval warfare, giving them a significant advantage over their amateurish opponents. In the space of 38 minutes, the palace's artillery positions were destroyed, its fortifications overrun, its warships sunk or captured, and its forces decimated. Entire companies of men were wiped out by single shells and artillery crews were blasted apart by rapid-fire cannons. Before long, the entire palace was in ruins. Its flags were hauled down and the conflict was effectively over. At 9:38 a.m., the firing stopped and smoke cleared. Only a handful of buildings remained undamaged. Most of the Sultan's palaces and fortifications were rubble and the streets were littered with debris, corpses, and dying men. To their surprise, the British discovered that Sultan Khalid had survived. He had slipped out of the city unobserved and escaped to the mainland, disguised as one of his cooks. Despite this embarrassing turn of events, the war was considered a great victory for the British, showcasing the overwhelming power of their navy. Within hours of the ceasefire, British troops landed and marched on the ruined city, raising the British flag over the Sultan's palace at noon. The following day, a new British-backed Sultan was installed and the British Empire's dominance over Zanzibar was confirmed. With the Anglo-Zanzibar War, Britain proved its naval supremacy, once again demonstrating the potential of modern naval firepower. In fact, the war remains the shortest recorded in human history, lasting only 38 minutes from the beginning of the bombardment to the moment it ended. During this brief conflict, hundreds of men lost their lives, ships were destroyed, and entire fortifications reduced to rubble. Yet when one considers the larger geopolitical context of the war, it becomes apparent just how little it changed. Britain's desire for control over Zanzibar remained, and the new Sultan installed by the British was just as compliant as the last. The policies of appeasement towards the Arabs and Indians were also continued, restoring many of them to positions of power and wealth. Ultimately, Britain's position in Zanzibar was little different after the war than it was before. The speed of the Anglo-Zanzibar War may have surprised many at the time, but it should not have been entirely shocking. Many of the innovations of modern warfare had already been put to use during previous conflicts, from ironclad warships to rapid-fire cannons to advanced optics and fire control systems. What set the Anglo-Zanzibar War apart was the combination of all these factors. For the first time ever, a naval battle between two opposing fleets was decided within seconds. And had Khalid proven unable or unwilling to negotiate, it's likely that the conflict could have been resolved in an even shorter amount of time. Although overshadowed by other colonial conflicts, the Anglo-Zanzibar War played a key role in establishing Britain's dominance in East Africa. Moreover, it remains an important case study in the evolution of warfare, showing how quickly battles can be decided when two sides are so technologically disparate. So what do you think? Would you have sided with the British or the Zanzibaris? Comment below. And if you want to learn more about ancient weaponry, check out the series Ancient Weapons Explained. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more interesting tales.